Chikars, my boyfriend, introduced me as his roommate's sublet tenant, 3 different times. So his high school crush wouldn't know I existed. This is the full story of how it fell apart. I need to preface this by saying that 8 months ago, I would have told you Derek Sullivan was the safest, most solid decision I had ever made in my adult life. And if you had told me back then that I would end up writing this out at 1 in the morning with a mug of cold chamomile tea going untouched on my desk, I would have laughed you out of the room. But here we are. And I think the only way I am going to process any of it is to lay it out from the very beginning. So bear with me because this is long and I promise every detail matters. I am 27. I am a second-year PhD student in clinical psychology at a state university in Ohio. And back in the spring, I was deep in the trenches of comprehensive exam prep, living on drip coffee and flashcards, when I started camping out most afternoons at a place called Windmill Coffee near campus, because it had the only outlets that weren't already colonized by undergrads, and because the woman who ran the espresso machine never judged me for ordering a 4th cold brew at 4 in the afternoon. That is where I met Derek, who was 28, worked in brand marketing for a mid-size outdoor gear company, and was, at the time, studying for the GMAT because he had some vague ambition of eventually going back for an MBA, though, as I would later learn, eventually was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. We started as study buddies, the kind of thing where you nod at each other over your laptops for 2 weeks before one of you finally says something. And he was the one who broke first, sliding into the seat across from me and asking if I wanted to split a slice of the lemon poppy seed loaf because he could not, in his words, responsibly eat an entire loaf of anything alone in public. It was corny. It worked. Within a month, we were dating properly, and within 3 months, I had met his parents at a barbecue in their backyard in Westerville, and he had met my mother over a stiff, extremely polite dinner at an Italian place downtown, where she interrogated him about his 5-year plan in a way that made us both want to sink into the floor, and somehow he survived it and even made her laugh twice, which is more than most people manage. By month 6, we were talking about signing a lease together once my current roommate's lease ran out, and by month 7, he had already pulled up flights for a trip to Portugal we were planning for the following spring, bookmarking little guest houses in the Douro Valley and sending me links captioned, "Imagine us here," with a winking emoji, and I want to be honest that I was genuinely, unguardedly happy. The kind of happy where you catch yourself smiling at your phone on the bus because he sent you a picture of his dog wearing sunglasses. I should mention here, because it matters for later, that my own living situation at the time was a little precarious in a way that made the relationship feel even more like solid ground. Since my roommate of 2 years, a woman named Grace, who I'd known since undergrad, had just accepted a job offer in Denver and given notice on our lease, which meant I was, functionally, apartment hunting in the middle of comprehensive exam season, a genuinely miserable combination, and Derek had been the one who kept telling me not to panic, that we could figure out something together once my current lease ended, that there was no rush. And I remember how much comfort I took from that, how much I let his calm reassurance stand in for an actual plan, which in hindsight was its own kind of foreshadowing, because a person who is quietly building an exit ramp for himself does not usually offer to merge lives with you, and yet at the time I read it as nothing but devotion. Then, right around month 8, everything started to shift. And it shifted because of a woman named Bianca Reyes, whom I had never met and who, until that point, existed for me only as a name Derek had mentioned exactly once, in passing, back when we were still in the getting-to-know-you phase, when he told me about a girl he'd had a massive, humiliating crush on for basically all 4 years of high school in Cincinnati, a girl who was smart and funny and completely, thoroughly uninterested in him, who had turned him down so gently and so completely at senior prom that he still, a decade later, referred to her as the one who got away, which at the time I found sort of sweet in a self-deprecating way, the kind of story guys tell to seem emotionally available. What I did not know, and what Derek did not tell me until it was basically already happening, was that Bianca Reyes had just relocated for a new job at a design firm 2 blocks from his office, and that he had run into her at a coffee cart on a random Tuesday, and that something in him had apparently short-circuited on the spot, because the version of my boyfriend who came home from that encounter was subtly, almost imperceptibly different, more distracted, checking his phone during dinner in a way he never used to, and when I asked him about it, he brushed it off as work stress, and I believed him, because why wouldn't I? The first real crack came at his company's summer happy hour, an event I had already been to twice before as his +1, so there was no ambiguity about my role there, and I remember I was wearing this green dress I'd bought specifically, because he'd said green was his favorite color on me, and I walked across the rooftop bar carrying 2 beers, one for him and one for me, feeling normal, feeling like his girlfriend, and as I handed him his drink and instinctively went to loop my arm around his waist the way I always did, he physically stepped back from me, just a half step, but enough that my arm closed on air, and then he stuck his hand out to shake mine like I was a stranger at a networking event, and said, loudly enough for the small cluster of coworkers nearby to hear, "Hey, thanks for the beer. This is actually a friend of mine from my grad program," gesturing vaguely at me as though I were a category rather than a person. I stood there holding my own beer like an idiot, and I looked past his shoulder and saw her for the first time, Bianca, in a linen blazer, dark hair, the kind of effortlessly put together that makes you self-conscious about your own outfit even when you know your outfit is fine. And I understood immediately and viscerally what had just happened, even before my brain had fully caught up, because some animal part of you always knows before your rational mind agrees to know. I did not make a scene. I smiled. I made small talk with 2 people from his product team. I finished my beer, and I left 40 minutes later without saying goodbye to him properly. And that night, he texted me a long, winding explanation about how things can get weird, mixing personal and professional life. How he just didn't want people at work speculating about our relationship, how it had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with boundaries. And I remember reading that text 3 times trying to decide if I was overreacting, which in hindsight is exactly the kind of question you ask yourself right before you let something much worse happen. I even called my friend Priya that night, half wanting her to tell me I was being paranoid. And she asked me a single question that I brushed off completely at the time, but that has replayed in my head 100 times since, which was simply, would he have shaken your hand like a stranger if you were his co-worker's actual friend, or only if you were his girlfriend? And I remember laughing it off and saying office culture is just weird sometimes, that I didn't want to turn one awkward handshake into a referendum on the whole relationship, and Priya, to her credit, didn't push. She just said, "Okay, but keep an eye on it," in the tone of someone who has seen this movie before and is trying very hard not to spoil the ending for you. I let it go. I told myself relationships require grace, that maybe he genuinely was self-conscious about office gossip, that this was a one-time lapse in judgment from an otherwise decent person, and for about 3 weeks things actually did seem fine. Better even, he was attentive. He planned a whole date night around my exam schedule. He sent flowers to my apartment with a card that said, "You've got this," the morning of my qualifying paper defense, and I let myself relax back into feeling secure. During that same stretch, my apartment situation finally resolved itself, sort of, because I found a decent 1-bedroom about 10 minutes from campus, and signed a lease on it alone, since Derek's proposal that we figure something out together never actually turned into an offer to look at places with me, and when I brought it up, gently, he said his current lease with Marcus still had 8 months on it, and it wouldn't make sense to break it, which was true on paper and which I accepted at the time, though I notice now that it meant I was the one who kept absorbing the practical cost of uncertainty, while he kept all his options, including apparently his romantic ones, wide open. Then came Marcus's birthday. Marcus Webb was Derek's roommate, a genuinely lovely guy, an elementary school teacher with the kind of unbothered warmth that made every party better, just by his being there. And he was turning 30 and having people over at their shared apartment, low-key, string lights on the balcony, a cooler of beer, nothing extravagant. I got there a little after Derek because I'd had a study group run long, and when I walked in, he was standing by the door talking to someone, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was her again, Bianca, apparently a +1 of one of Marcus's coworkers, an absolute coincidence that felt at the time like the universe actively conspiring against me, and instead of turning to introduce me, Derek angled his body slightly away, continued his conversation, and when Marcus, who did not know what was going on and had no reason to suspect anything, turned to me and asked in front of everyone, "Hey, who's this?" Derek answered before I could open my mouth, saying, with a completely straight face, that I was a woman who had come by earlier in the week to look at the empty 3rd bedroom because she was thinking about subletting it. A woman looking at a bedroom. That was the sentence my boyfriend of 8 months used to describe me at his own roommate's birthday party, standing 4 feet away from me, while I stood there in a room full of his friends holding a warm can of hard seltzer, waiting for him to correct himself, to laugh it off, to do literally anything other than what he actually did, which was nothing. He just let it sit there. And worse, not 20 minutes later, I watched Bianca ask him, casually, whether he was seeing anyone, and I watched my boyfriend, standing close enough to me that his elbow could have brushed my sleeve, say, "Nah, keeping my options open right now," and something in my chest went cold and very, very quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't calm so much as it is your body deciding to conserve energy because it senses a threat it hasn't fully processed yet. There was one more small, awful detail from that party that I didn't fully register until days later, which is that at some point Marcus, trying to be a good host, had asked me to help him carry a cooler out to the balcony. And while we were out there alone for a minute, he mentioned, offhandedly, that Derek had been talking about Bianca for weeks, that he'd assumed the two of them had some kind of unresolved history, because Derek kept bringing her up unprompted, kept mentioning little things she'd said at the coffee cart, kept asking Marcus, almost sheepishly, whether he thought she seemed single. And Marcus said all this with no idea it would mean anything to me, just party small talk. And I stood there on that balcony holding a bag of ice, smiling and nodding along, while a very calm, very cold part of my brain quietly filed the information away. I left that party early again. I did not cry in front of anyone. I cried in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes, checked my makeup in the visor mirror, and drove home. And that night, lying awake, I did the thing I now recognize as a classic trauma brain move, which is that I built him an excuse before he even had to build one for himself, telling myself he must be embarrassed about how intense his old crush had been, that this was some kind of anxious overcorrection, that surely, a person who brought flowers to my dissertation defense and met my mother and mapped out a whole vacation with me would not actually be capable of quietly erasing me from his own life in real time. He texted the next morning, apologizing vaguely for the confusion, and I let it go again. And I want to be honest with anyone reading this that the reason I let it go twice is not because I am stupid or because I don't have self-respect. It's because when you love someone, your brain will construct entire cathedrals of justification rather than accept that the person might simply be doing something cruel. And it took a third incident, an incident so blatant it finally cracked the whole structure, for me to stop building. The third time was the company's annual summer barbecue, the big one, held at a park pavilion with a company-branded banner and those little chalkboard signs listing the menu. An event Derek told me, in advance, in a text, was employees only, sorry. They're being strict about the guest list this year, which stung but which I accepted, because I had no reason at that point to think he was lying outright. Not yet. And I spent that Saturday instead, getting drinks with my friend Priya and complaining. In the vague, unspecific way you complain when you haven't fully admitted the shape of the problem to yourself yet. 2 days later, scrolling Instagram before bed, I saw the event's official page, posted by the company's social media team, and one of the photos in the carousel, a wide shot of the pavilion, clearly showed a banner that read, "Employees plus guests welcome." And my stomach dropped before my brain even finished reading the words, and I kept scrolling. And there she was, Bianca Reyes, in the background of 3 separate photos, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. Her actual boyfriend, as it turned out. Someone she'd apparently been seeing for months. And then I made the mistake, or maybe it was a gift, of scrolling to her personal page. And I watched, in real time, my own boyfriend's name pop up as a like on 12 different posts of hers going back 2 years, 12 little red hearts stacked up like some pathetic shrine, liked in the span of about 90 seconds, meaning he had gone home from that barbecue and sat there scrolling her entire page, liking things retroactively, while I sat at home believing his lie about a strict guest list. I did not confront him that night. I have never been a person who does her best thinking in the heat of the moment, so instead I closed the app, put my phone face down on the nightstand, and lay there in the dark, doing math, and the math was ugly. 3 separate, deliberate erasures. Not accidents, not awkward slip-ups, a pattern, a strategy even, and somewhere around 2 in the morning I stopped crying and started, very calmly, thinking. What I decided to do next is the part of this story that some people are going to have opinions about, and I'll own that up front. I did not go for the dramatic confrontation. I did not throw his things out a window. I went a quieter and, I think, considerably more effective route, because if Derek Sullivan wanted so badly to be single in front of Bianca Reyes, I was going to help him get there, permanently, and I was going to do it without raising my voice once. I texted Marcus, Derek's roommate, and asked if he wanted to grab coffee that weekend, just the 2 of us, which wasn't totally out of the ordinary since Marcus and I got along well and had hung out one-on-one a handful of times before, and over lattes at, fittingly, a different coffee shop than the one where all of this started. I mentioned, very casually, that I thought Bianca seemed really sharp and easy to talk to, that she had this dry sense of humor I'd noticed even in the little bit I'd interacted with her, that she seemed like someone worth getting to know, and I watched Marcus's ears go faintly pink, because Marcus, as it turned out, had already clocked Bianca at that same barbecue and thought she was cute, but assumed, reasonably, that there was some history between her and his roommate that made her off limits. And I told him, truthfully, that as far as I knew, there was nothing romantic there at all, which, given that she had a boyfriend and had shown zero interest in Derek beyond friendly small talk, was completely accurate. I want to be clear that I did not manufacture anything. I did not lie. I simply removed a false obstacle and let two adults who were, independently, already interested in each other, find their own way there, because Bianca's actual relationship, the one with the guy from the barbecue photos, ended about 3 weeks later. Something about him getting a job offer across the country and neither of them wanting to do long distance. And around that same time, Marcus, encouraged, ran into her at a trivia night at a bar downtown that half his friend group frequented, struck up a conversation about boat trips because it turned out they'd both grown up sailing on Lake Erie, bonded over a shared, slightly unfashionable love of classic rock, and by the 2-week mark after that trivia night, they were, by all accounts, officially dating, a fact I learned not from Derek, who by this point I was barely speaking to, but from Marcus himself, who texted me a slightly sheepish, "Hey, so this is weird to tell you, but Bianca and I are a thing now. Thank you for the nudge." To which I responded with genuine enthusiasm, because I liked Marcus and I liked the idea of Bianca ending up with someone who would actually introduce her properly at parties. Derek did not take it well. Derek did not take it well in the specific way that a person takes things badly when their own hidden agenda has just been publicly, irreversibly foreclosed by someone else's happiness. And 3 nights after he found out, he showed up at my apartment at 11 at night, banging on my door hard enough that my downstairs neighbor later complained about it. And when I opened it, he was somewhere between furious and wrecked, asking me, with real venom in his voice, why I would do that, why I would introduce Bianca to Marcus of all people. And I remember standing in my doorway in an oversized t-shirt, arms crossed, feeling strangely calm. And I asked him very evenly what exactly the problem was, since as far as I knew, Bianca was just a friend of his from high school. And he opened his mouth and then closed it again, because he could not answer that question honestly without admitting to everything. Without saying out loud, "I have been trying to leave my actual girlfriend invisible for 2 months so I could have a shot with a woman who was never interested in me." And the silence that followed, him standing on my doorstep at 11 at night with absolutely nothing true he could say, was the loudest confirmation I ever got. That was effectively the end, though it took another 2 weeks of slow-motion collapse to actually finish, because breakups like this rarely end cleanly in one scene. They end in a series of smaller scenes, and mine included my friends Priya and Sam sitting me down over wine one night and telling me, gently but firmly, things they'd apparently been holding back for weeks, that Derek had never once brought me up unprompted in the group chats he was in with mutual friends, that at a game night back in month 5 he'd introduced me to a coworker's wife as a friend from the coffee shop, a detail I hadn't even clocked as a red flag at the time because I hadn't been looking for a pattern yet, and hearing it laid out like that, event after event, stacked in a neat little timeline by people who loved me and had nothing to gain by lying, was almost worse than any single incident on its own, because it meant this hadn't started with Bianca at all. Bianca had just been the spark that finally made the smoke visible. Around that same period, I ran into Tyler, one of Derek's co-workers, at a mutual friend's dinner, and over the course of the evening, in the unguarded way people talk when they've had 2 glasses of wine and don't realize how much they're revealing, he mentioned that Derek had been a mess at the office for weeks, distracted, missing a deadline on a campaign brief, and that everyone in the department had assumed it was some kind of breakup. And I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth thinking about the profound, almost comedic unfairness of a man tanking his own performance review over a woman who, as Tyler put it without any prompting from me, barely talks about Derek at all. Honestly, I don't think she thinks of him as anything but a guy from high school, which lined up exactly with what I already suspected, that this entire 8-month erosion of my relationship had been in service of a fantasy that existed almost entirely in Derek's head. I ran into Bianca herself once more after that, at a group dinner a mutual friend organized. One of those sprawling long-table restaurant reservations where you end up seated next to someone you barely know, and she and I got to talking, and at some point, carefully, without making it a whole confessional, I mentioned that Derek and I had actually been together for 8 months before all of this, dating the whole time he'd been hovering around her, and I watched her face shift from polite interest to visible discomfort, and she said, and I remember this almost word for word because it validated something I badly needed validated, that she had genuinely had no idea, that he'd always presented himself as single and a little lonely, that if she'd known there was someone he was actively hiding, someone he was actively lying to, she would have kept her distance entirely, both because it was a decent thing to do and because, in her words, that's a genuinely unhinged way to treat a person you supposedly care about. And hearing a total stranger, someone with zero reason to take my side, independently arrive at the exact same read on the situation that my friends had, was oddly one of the most healing moments of the whole ordeal. The actual final ending happened, almost too poetically, at the same coffee shop where Derek and I met, because he texted asking if we could talk in person one last time, and I agreed, mostly because I wanted closure, and partly because some small, stubborn part of me needed to hear him say something, anything, that acknowledged what he'd done. And we sat at a table near the window, and I brought his spare key, the one to my apartment, and slid it across the table without much ceremony, and he tried weakly to frame the whole thing as a series of misunderstandings, as him just being bad at handling the social overlap. And I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that erasing your partner of 8 months to your friends and coworkers isn't an accident that happens once. It's a decision. And it's a decision you apparently made and remade 3 separate times, in 3 separate settings, with 3 separate lies constructed on the spot to support it, and that a person who truly valued me would never have needed to hide me from anyone, let alone from a woman he hadn't spoken to in a decade. He didn't have a good response to that. He didn't really have a response at all. What happened afterward in the weeks and months that followed is honestly the part of this story I'm proudest of, not because I orchestrated some grand revenge plot, but because I let the whole ugly situation redirect my energy somewhere useful instead of somewhere bitter. I threw myself back into my dissertation work with a kind of focus I hadn't had in months. I gave a conference presentation on attachment patterns in early adulthood that, in a twist of dark irony, drew more directly on my own recent experience than I let on to the audience, and I got a genuinely warm reception, several faculty members approaching me afterward with questions, and a few weeks after that, I got the email I'd been quietly hoping for since January, an acceptance into a fully funded doctoral track at a program I'd been eyeing for 2 years, the kind of acceptance that comes with a fellowship stipend and actual research funding. And I sat in my apartment reading it 3 times before I let myself believe it was real. I called my mother first, the same mother who had grilled Derek over Italian food a lifetime ago, and when I told her the news, she cried a little on the phone, and then, in classic fashion, immediately asked whether Derek knew yet, and I had to remind her, gently, that Derek and I hadn't spoken in weeks, and that this particular victory belonged entirely to me, a sentence that felt strange and enormous coming out of my mouth, like trying on a piece of clothing I didn't yet know fit. Priya and Sam threw me a ridiculous, over-the-top little dinner to celebrate. String lights on Priya's patio, a cake that said "Doctor" in shaky handwritten icing months before I'd technically earned the title. And at some point in the evening, Sam raised a glass and said, only half joking, that Derek Sullivan had accidentally done me the biggest favor of his life. And everyone laughed. And I laughed too, because by that point it had actually started to feel true, rather than like something I was forcing myself to believe. Marcus and Bianca, for what it's worth, are still together. They moved in together this past spring into a little rental with a porch that Bianca has apparently already covered in string lights. And Marcus still texts me occasionally, half out of genuine friendship and half, I think, out of a lingering guilt over the fact that his roommate's ex-girlfriend was the reason he met the love of his life. Though I've told him more than once there's nothing to feel guilty about. Derek, as far as I've heard through the mutual friend Grapevine, moved out of the apartment he shared with Marcus not long after that final coffee shop conversation, apparently unable to stomach living with the man who was now dating the woman he'd blown up his relationship for, and started seeing a therapist, which multiple people have described to me as long overdue, given that even in the version of events he told other people, there was clearly some deep, unresolved insecurity from being rejected so completely in high school that he never actually processed, just carried around for a decade like a splinter, until it finally infected an entire relationship that had nothing to do with the original wound. I heard secondhand that he eventually apologized to me a second time, in person, at a bookstore of all places, a run-in neither of us had planned, and that the apology was, according to him, more sincere than the coffee shop one had been, though by that point I was already deep into my new program, and had, frankly, stopped needing anything from him at all, which is its own kind of ending. I also heard he's dating someone new now, someone from his therapy-adjacent friend circle, and I genuinely hope, without a trace of bitterness, that he's doing the work to make sure he doesn't do this again to whoever that is. As for me, I think about this whole chapter now less as a heartbreak story and more as a strange roundabout gift, because being erased 3 times by someone who claimed to love me is what finally made me stop making myself smaller to accommodate other people's insecurities. And it pushed me, almost by accident, toward a version of my life that is genuinely better than the one I was building around Derek's 5-year plan. A version where I am surrounded by people, Priya and Sam, and even, weirdly, Marcus and Bianca, who actually introduce me by my name. It is a strange thing to sit with, the idea that the worst 8 months of your adult life can, given enough distance, look almost like a hinge point rather than a wound. But that is genuinely how I have come to think about it. And every so often, usually late at night when I am procrastinating on a literature review I should be finishing, I think back to that first afternoon at Windmill Coffee, to the version of me who thought splitting a slice of lemon poppy seed loaf with a stranger was the start of something safe, and I don't feel angry at her anymore. I mostly just feel a kind of tired affection, the way you might feel toward a younger sibling who made a decision you understand completely even though you know how it turns out. I still go to that coffee shop sometimes, though I've switched my order to a plain drip because the cold brew there never tasted quite the same after everything, and the barista who runs the espresso machine, the same one who never judged my 4th coffee of the day, asked me once casually whatever happened to that guy, and I told her, honestly, that he taught me an enormous amount about the difference between being loved and being kept around as an option, and she nodded like she'd heard some version of that sentence 100 times before, which, working where she works, she probably has. If there's a moral in here, and I'm not entirely sure there needs to be one, it's that a person who is unwilling to claim you in front of the one specific audience that matters most to them is telling you something true about your actual status in their life, no matter how many flights to Portugal they bookmark, or how many flowers they send the morning of your dissertation defense. And it took me 3 separate, humiliating erasures to finally believe what my own gut had been quietly saying since that very first happy hour, but I believe it now, completely, and I am not going back to not believing it, not for anyone.